Hey, good morning or morning for us here. We are in our lesson 13 of Isaiah part 1, and that means we're getting ready to end next week. So I think I've mentioned that we will start part 2 in our class at the beginning of June. And so I will link, because I don't think I did it before, the information for ordering that book if you would like to do so. If you can't afford that, if that's not something that you can do right now, then you can just study along with us right through the book of Isaiah, and we will begin with Isaiah 40. So if you're catching up with us now and didn't do part 1, you could spend the time between now and June 1st reading the first half of the book of Isaiah, chapters 1 through 39, just to become familiar with the content. And we'll hit it with a small review when we start back up, but that would be a good way for you to get started. So for those of you that have been watching with us, I just want to say hi, and I hope that you have been blessed. And I'm just grateful to those ladies that meet with us every week that have been willing to be recorded so that you can join with us. And so thank you. And we will be starting this morning's discussion in just a little bit. So I just wanted to come on and say hi and let you know where we're headed, and that I will link that information for you. Bye-bye. Okay, so what do you find there?
Whoa.
Whoa, right? So we had a group of chapters of oracles, and now we have a group of woes. And so what you want to do is to be able to go through chapters 28 to 32 with just a short statement, at least, of who the woe is directed at. So if you were to look at chapter 28, who is that woe to?
Ephraim.
Okay, and we say Ephraim. Who does that mean, Marcy?
Um,
You guys remember?
Israel.
Israel. So the northern kingdom, right? So the northern kingdom, this was a woe to them. What happens in chapter 29?
Woe to Jerusalem.
To Jerusalem. So that's back in Judah, right? So we have him still speaking to both parts of the nation now. In the middle of that chapter, there's another woe. Who does that one go to? Jasmine?
Those who plan,
Oh, go ahead, Kim. It's fine.
those who deeply hide their plans from the Lord.
Okay, good. And then that continues that idea. We can see who these people are at the beginning of chapter 30. What does he call them? Jasmine?
Rebellious children.
Okay, and so who are we talking about when we talk about rebellious children?
The Israelites.
Right, so still the people of Judah at least, and since he's been giving woes to the other ones, we know he's looking at Judah here, but in chapter 31, he labels them a different way, but we can see this picture of rebellion, this picture of people who hide their plans from the Lord. What are his people of Judah doing that he's calling them out for?
Going to Egypt.
Okay, so those who go down to Egypt for help. Instead of relying on him, they're relying on another nation, just as Ahaz did earlier when we looked at chapter 7 and his history. Okay, the only chapter that stands out in this group is chapter 32, and it talks about at the timing of some of these same things, something different will happen. How did you guys label or theme chapter 32?
A king will reign righteously.
Okay, good. That's a good one. Anybody use anything else?
I said there'll be trials and devastation until the Spirit is poured out from on high.
Okay, good. And so either of those two things would be a focus I would use. Yeah, that king's going to reign or the Spirit will be poured out, either way. And the way Kim said it does connect it to what was happening previously as well. So good. So that's where we were in our previous lesson. We were in woes given to God's people essentially here. When we get to chapter 33 then, let's go ahead and read 33. I don't know if we'll have time or if I'll remember for us to read the other ones, but let's go ahead and read chapter 33. You guys have, who would like to do the first page for us? Marcy?
I don't know
And
where to stop though,
we'll
Chris.
stop at verse 9.
By verse 9, okay.
Yeah, that'll be good. About verses 10 to 19. Jim, and then the little chunk 20 to 24. Karen, all right, whenever you're ready, Marcy.
Woe to you, O destroyer, while you were not destroyed, and he who is treacherous, while others did not deal treacherously with him. As soon as you shall finish destroying, you shall be destroyed. As soon as you shall cease to deal treacherously, others will deal treacherously with you. O Lord, be gracious to us. We have waited for thee. Be thou thy strength every morning, our salvation also in the time of distress. At the sound of the tumult, people flee. At the lifting up of thyself, nations dispense. And thy spoil is gathered as the caterpillar gathers. As locusts rushing about, men rush about on it. The Lord is exalted, for he dwells on high. He has filled Zion with justice and righteousness, and he shall be the stability of the times. A wealth of salvation, wisdom, and knowledge, the fear of the Lord is the treasure. Behold, their brave men cry in the streets, the ambassadors of peace weep bitterly. The highways are desolate, the travelers have ceased. He has broken the covenant, he has despised the cities. He has no regard for men. The land mourns and the pines away. Lebanon is shamed and withers. Sharon is like a desert plain, and Bashan and Camel lose their foliage.
Now I will arise, says the Lord. Now I will be exalted. Now I will be lifted up. You have conceived chaff. You will give birth to stubble. My breath will consume you like a fire. The peoples will be burned to lime, like cut thorns which are burned in the fire. You who are far away, hear what I have done, and you who are near, acknowledge my might. Sinners in Zion are terrified. Trembling has seized the godless. Who among us can live with the consuming fire? Who among us can live with continual burning? He who walks righteously and speaks with sincerity, he who rejects unjust gain and shakes his hands so that they hold no bribe, he who stops his ears from hearing about bloodshed and shuts his eyes from looking upon evil. He will dwell on the heights. His refuge will be the impregnable rock. His bread will be given him. His water will be sure. Your eyes will see the king in his beauty. They will behold a far distant land. Your heart will meditate on terror. Where is he who counts? Where is he who weighs? Where is he who counts the towers? You will no longer see a fierce people, a people of unintelligible speech which no one comprehends, of a stammering tongue which no one understands.
Look upon Zion, the city of our appointed feasts. Your eyes will see Jerusalem, an undisturbed habitation, a tent which will not be folded. Its stakes will never be pulled up, nor any of its cords be torn apart. But there the majestic one, the Lord, will be for us, a place of rivers and wide canals, on which no boat with oars will go, and on which no mighty ship will pass. For the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king. He will save us. Your tackle hangs slack, it cannot hold the base of its mast firmly, nor spread out the sail. Then the prey of an abundant spoil will be divided. The lame will take the plunder, and no resident will say, I am sick. The people who dwell there will be forgiven their iniquity.
Okay, good. Does anybody else have the experience that when you all are reading out loud, you go, oh, it sounds it makes more sense when you hear it as conversation. Sometimes it's much easier, I think, to just hear God speaking versus the other thing. So anyway, it's something I do sometimes, but I forget to read out loud, but I think it's a good thing. Okay, so if you were just right away to look at the first verse, at least verse 1, this is one of those chapters that we'll see about what time frame we're talking about. And even though it may be the same time frame, the discussion jumps back and forth, sometimes verse to verse. He focuses on a different aspect of what's happening. So it's one of those where you kind of have to track where he's headed. So what are we talking about in verse 1? How does it connect to our previous section of verses, chapters?
Whoa.
Woe, starts with a woe. So to whom is this woe directed?
The Azarians,
Assyria?
Okay,
the Syrians.
it could be Assyria, but what does scripture say?
Destroyer.
Destroyer. So yeah, we can look for context, and that is quite possible, because who is the nation who's coming or getting ready to come against Judah? Assyria, right? So yeah, so, and if those of you who looked it up, you would see that. But we see to a destroyer, their destroyer. And what do you learn in verse 1 about this destroyer? Why is it a woe?
As soon as he's finished destroying, he'll be destroyed.
Okay, good. So how does that line up with other things that we have seen in these chapters in Isaiah?
Always fits.
Why?
Well, he has used other
Always
countries.
punishes.
Go ahead, B.
He has used other countries to pour out his judgment, and then he reverses that, and then they're in trouble.
Good. So that's the pattern we have seen in the past, and he's saying the same thing here. And we'll also sort of get a why as we look at some of the other things in here. Okay, as you get ready now, when we move into verse 2, the focus shifts. In fact, the speaker shifts, the language shifts. What's happening in verse 2?
Isaiah is crying out to God
Okay,
or speaking to God.
or well, who else? Well, it could be Isaiah. This is what would we call this language?
Prayer.
Prayer. So we know it is Isaiah, but who does he include with him?
It says we, so probably the nation of Israel or
Right.
Judah.
So we, and what is he asking for?
To be gracious and for strength.
So be gracious to us. We have, what's the key? Who are this group of people, Karen?
They've waited for you.
The ones who have
Believers.
waited. Yeah, good. And so in this chapter, as you looked at it, we're going to talk about a picture of two different groups of people. And so this would be one, and you could label them differently, but we're going to start to see a contrast back and forth between two kinds of people, and then what happens to each kind of people. So Isaiah here is saying there's a group of us, we have waited for you. And what does he call the Lord here? What is he to them?
Their strength and salvation.
Okay, notice that word salvation. Again, we've started to see, you've probably noticed with that being partly built into Isaiah's name and part of the things, look back at how many chapters maybe you could see where he talks about salvation and being saved by the Lord. And so even in this time, even in these chapters, that's a promise that we've had, right? That God is their salvation and will be there. Okay. At the time, right? At what time is he going to be the salvation?
Time of distress.
In the time of distress. So when that happens, when that comes, he is salvation strength. And that's a great prayer. Like if you ever want to pray back scripture to God, this would be one you might want to hang on to. Put this verse somewhere. Okay, now in 3 and 4, we have a different focus. What is happening at this time of distress? Maybe you see this focus How is that described? And for what people do you see?
The people and nations are fleeing. The believers are staying there because he's their strength and salvation, but everybody else is running away.
Okay, good. And how is this, what else is happening at this time when the nations disperse? What's happening with God?
He's being lifted up.
So he's being lifted up. So again, as you look for those connections, what's happening with God, what's happening with nations, and what's happening with his people. And then it helps, I think, sometimes tie that in. So a time when nations are dispersing, he is risen up, and his people are being strengthened by him. He's still their salvation. In fact, then in 5 and 6, he goes on to describe this timing for him. What do you learn in those two verses? What else will happen at that same time?
That's going to be the stability of your times, a wealth of salvation, wisdom, and knowledge.
Yes, good. How else is he described again? This was probably something you might have seen as a pattern again in this chapter. He is
Exalted.
He's exalted and dwelling on high. So notice the repeated use of things like lifted up and exalted as you go through this chapter. Where is the focus here? He dwells on high, but what other place is mentioned?
Zion,
Yeah, and what will it be like in Zion?
he's filled, it should be filled with justice and righteousness.
Okay, good. Is that help you with knowing what time frame we're looking at here? Where do you think we are as they asked you prophetically on your prophetic picture?
Millennial kingdom.
Okay, so
Or
this is
tribulation to millennial.
this is the part that's yet to come. Remember, as Isaiah jumps back and forth to, yes, as far as Assyria goes, as far as nations go, did all those things happen once? Yes, but the full picture has never happened yet. And so you connect those to a time when that will happen again. And we're going to see that reference. Good. How else is this time frame? So we've gone back and forth to a time of woe to those who are to the treacherous one, God's people praying for his graciousness, God saying he's going to be lifted up, but nations will disperse. Which focus do we go back to for verses 7 to 9? What do you think he's saying there? What can you tell for sure? What's being described? Melinda?
Well, everything's going to be desolate
Okay.
and like a desert.
Okay, good. So have we seen passages describing lands becoming like that again at these times? Yeah, so we see that similar picture. If you notice the locations, from what I could tell, those were at that time very abundant, fertile places, like known for that. And that's not what they will be, what they will become. Okay. Any questions or anything right there? Okay, does the pattern change again when we hit verse 10? Who's the focus in 10 to 12?
God.
God again. Now you see those same things, right? If you've been marking that somehow that he's going to be lifted up or those kinds of words, which ones would you see here again in verse 10? How many times does he describe that?
3. He will
Yeah,
rise, he'll be exalted, he'll be lifted up.
okay, good. So this was the one where as Kim was reading this, I just felt like this sounds so clear when it's read out loud. He was saying, I will be lifted up. What else is going to happen? When he's lifted up,
They're gonna be destroyed, burned.
They-
Like everything you thought you were doing so well, it's gone.
yes, yes. So you have conceived chaff, you'll give birth to stubble. So again, we know that that's a picture of nothing or desolation or not growth, right? And then again, 3 times in those 2 verses, the way he's going to do it, right? In fire and burned. And we see the peoples. Okay.
Yeah, it's really Revelation again.
Yes, the Revelation verses here, just the connections to Revelation are just constantly there. Okay, so this again, you could start to make a list. I don't remember if they asked us. It was a picture I saw. I don't remember if they asked you to look at this group of what he called the people who waited, and then we'll see them described in another way, versus the nations or these other peoples, right? You can see how they're about to be described. And he continues that description in verses 13 and 14, which kinds of people are the focus there?
The sinners, the godless, and the godless meant hypocrites and profane.
Okay, good. Thank you. So there's that group. As he moves into 15, then he speaks to a different group of people. We might say these same ones, those who have waited, how are they described in verses 15 and 16? This is a beautiful promise and passage for us.
Well, there's quite a list. He
Yeah,
who walks righteously, speaks with sincerity, rejects unjust gain, shakes his hands so that they will hold no bribe. He stops his ears from hearing about bloodshed, shuts his eyes from looking upon evil.
Yeah.
Will dwell on the heights. Refuge will be the impregnable rock. Bread will be given him, and water will be sure.
yeah. As Melinda said, that is quite a list. And so I think they did have you focus on that at the very end of the chapter, right? Is this a way that you're walking, so that you would walk this way, and then also have the promises that are given in verse 16, right? So we have a way of being according to verse 15, and then promises in verse 16. Let's look just a minute. What does it mean to you when it says that we would reject unjust gain and have hands that hold no bribe? How would you describe that in your own words or for somebody else?
You work for what you're given. You don't just take it. You don't expect it to be given to you. You know, it's you. Your gain is something that you've worked for. That's how I took
Okay,
it.
good. That'd be one way. Anything else anybody's thinking of? How you would be or not be?
Honest.
Honest, right? So this is honest and not cheating or not lying, not stealing. Good. What do you think about the verses that talk about to stop your ears from hearing bloodshed, to shut your eyes from looking upon evil, as we have been people who've been focused, at least since chapter 7, on the idea that we do have to pay attention to what's going on. So what's the balance here of paying attention and then not doing what these verses say? What do you think he's saying here?
I would take it more as the in the world, not of the world type thing, where you could go seeking to hear about bloodshed, but you know, knowing it's there and seeking out information and being fascinated by all that is 2 different things.
Yeah, I think Karen's word of fascinated by is a great word. I think I didn't have that word. That's perfect. That's sort of where my mind went, is we're going to know, but what's that focus? I think the other word that came to my mind was bloodlust, right? This idea that, and the danger of that, is that a real danger? Is it very possible to get very focused or connected in on continually watching and listening to evil and to bloodshed in our day?
Mhm.
Yeah. What makes that such an easy danger to fall into?
Because it's what we see. But it takes our eyes off of the Lord. And this is just a focus on the Lord rather than focus on what's going on. But it's there. It's in the news. It's in
There.
what you hear from people. It's just there.
Yeah.
That's our
Horrible, horrible,
entertainment too.
Yes. Kim, go ahead and say that again, would you?
I said it's our entertainment now too. It's like, our movies, our video games, our television shows are either sex or violence. It's one or the other, most of them. It's not, they just, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's there in so many ways. And I think this was, for me, this was a great reminder that when I look at the weeks where the news becomes weary, sometimes it has nothing to do with bloodshed, but it does have to do with evil. Sometimes it does have to do with bloodshed. That's there so much. And how many times do I need to hear or see the same story? That was a word to me, was to make sure that even though I want to know, but I don't need to continually fill my brain with the same bad news over and over and over again.
We used to have, I was talking to a friend yesterday about it, you used to have your morning news, your local news, and then you'd have local news at 5:30 and 6 o'clock to 6:30, you'd have the national news, and that was it. And now it's 24/7 on about, 8, 12 different channels. You can get everybody screaming at you about the same stories over and over and over again.
Yes. Yeah. So I think for me, this was a really good reminder of being careful of where my focus, and then making sure that when I am connected to the reality of what's going on, that I do what Barb was mentioning, which is then, to turn my eyes to God about it, to pray about that situation, or to take in what I need to know and then put it in that, what Karen said, which is in the world, but not of the world, to not also to make sure, knowing him, that I stay, if it's something that would make you panic, not to do that. If it was something that would make you depressed, again, that's where we each have to weigh. Not one of us probably has the same exact tolerance level for what we can watch, see, or take in and still be sane people who don't just want to stay locked in the house and never go out and see anybody. So I think it's good to weigh our emotions and our thoughts with God and look and see what we're filling our minds with, because for sure the balance should be more time with God than time with those things. And maybe that's a moment where we can say, I'm a little off balance here. Maybe I did have time in the Word, and maybe I had time in the news or whatever, but maybe there wasn't enough balance there. And just for me, it was a good reminder. Any other thoughts on that section?
No, but the next section is like what happens
Yes.
as you do that.
Yes.
Then the Lord becomes everything, and
Yes.
and you'll no longer see the fierce people. Will they be there? It doesn't say if they're going to be there or not, but you're not going to see them.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
they're not going to be the focus, the notice.
yes. Well, depending on this time frame, are they going to be there?
No.
No. So if we're talking about the day you're going to see the king in his beauty, where does it say we'll behold that? We're going to behold what? Verse 17.
Far distant land.
A far distant land. Where do you think that is?
I hope
Yeah,
not.
we're gone.
Yeah, it's with God, right? And so it's later. And yes, that focus here is that even though it says your heart will meditate on terror, is it saying it here in a way that it's because there is terror or there isn't terror?
You'll understand it maybe,
Yeah.
why it was there, but it won't
Right.
be
So
there.
that
Physically,
focus,
it won't be there. But even we can live in a sense of that now.
Mhm.
We can
Mhm.
see
Mhm.
it's there and we can, but it's not our focus. So we have the King in his beauty. We don't notice those things. We don't gaze at those things. We gaze at the Lord and those things become minor. And we look upon Zion, we see Jerusalem, I don't know, there's a like a spiritual application to something that's actually happening.
Yeah, I see what you're saying there. I think that is a good promise also for now, that a way to focus on that. There's also another way to look at the rest of these verses in context, but Kim?
There's several of the translations that say that you'll meditate on the former terror, on the
Yes.
stuff that was before,
Yes.
not what's happening, not where you are now. It's like,
Yes. So in the time frame we're talking about, these are like rhetorical questions, right? This is the former. Where is he? Where is he who did this? Where is that fierce people? You won't see them because they're not going to be there. I do like Barb's application for how, if we're focused on God, we can have that now, right? We can have that now. So I do like the spiritual application there. You won't see those people. How else are those fierce people described in verse 19?
Unintelligible people that no one comprehends, which is kind of funny, because don't you feel that way sometimes about all these thoughts about this or this, and you think, huh? That
Yes,
doesn't even make sense.
doesn't make sense. So this is, again, one of those verses where I literally just wrote an aside. Okay, here's another one. This is today. God, you clearly wrote the book of Isaiah, not just generally for our times, but for like 2021, maybe back to 2020, right? This is today. If you ever sit and feel like you're hearing nonsense, God says there's a day coming, well, that will go away. But he does say it happens, right? There's a time where it's happening. And that's now. Things don't line up. People say two different things. They say different things on one day. Different people don't agree. Experts don't agree. It's very challenging. It's very difficult to try to make sense of what's coming. And I appreciate that God knew exactly and described it here. Also, as I keep saying, Psalms and Proverbs describe this time frame as well. They talk about foolishness and nonsense all the time. A time of nonsense and a time of foolishness. The fool versus the wise. It's an amazing picture that just makes me sort of go, okay, God, well, thank you that I know you understand the days that we live in. Yes, and as Barb and Kim both pointed out, when this focus of what location, again, when we look at this time frame, there is only one place ever focused on, and what is it? Where is it? Verse 20.
Zion,
Zion. Where else? What's the other city listed?
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem. And what will it be like for Jerusalem? It's described in about 4 different ways there.
An undisturbed habitation, a tent which will not be folded, its stakes will never be pulled up, nor any of its cords be torn apart.
Okay, he made sure we understood that, right? Jerusalem will be an undisturbed habitation. Has that happened ever yet today? Is it now? No, it is not now. It is a very disturbed habitation. It is split right down the middle. It has locations that belong to 3 different people. So it is currently not an undisturbed habitation, but that promise is there. The promise continues there. Who will be? Who will be there?
The Lord.
The Lord. And then how's this picture described? What will it be like when he's there? He'll be like what?
I love that. He
Yeah,
before us. That's probably one of the most delightful things about the Lord, his forminess. And it gives me a vision of being for people.
Okay,
You know,
good, good.
for me.
Yeah. what's the part that goes with that? How else? What did you guys take from that part? The next sort of poetic description.
Still water. That's what
Yeah,
I got.
what about it, Karen?
That's what it's supposed to be like. He's supposed to be like a calm. If there's boats that aren't big enough to have oars or no mighty ships, then the water would be like glass. It'd just be calm.
Okay, good. The other picture would be currently, if there were waters and boats were passing and ships were passing in connection with what's going to happen to Judah, what might that indicate when you have mighty ships passing?
War.
The war, right? That time's going to go. So all of those pictures are just so beautiful there. You learn a nice list about God in verse 22. What does that one tell you about the Lord?
He's our judge, our
Yeah.
lawgiver, and our king.
Yeah. Does
He will
that
save
sound
us.
familiar? Those three different things?
It's our system of government.
It is our system of government, and the Lord will be all of them, right? Legislative, executive, and judicial. How would you like to live under that leadership? That would be ideal, right? And the final thing, he will, in that same verse,
Save us.
save us. Again, if you're marking salvation and save, you will see them a lot here. Good. I'm going to jump to 24 and then I'll ask you about the other part. I want to see the end because it goes with this focus we've had, where it says the people will dwell there. What's the there?
Zion.
Zion and Jerusalem, right? We're still talking about that. And what will happen for the people who dwell there?
They're forgiven.
They will be forgiven, their iniquity forgiven. What did you take from verse 23 in there? I guess the picture is described that way, maybe because it relates to 21. I don't know. I found it interesting. I did read a commentary about it, but then quickly forgot like exactly what you said. When somebody else wrote it, I think I read Wiersbe. I thought, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. And then I forgot how it would be described. Anybody else look that up or have a thought about verse 23? No.
It's almost like provision without having to work so hard to get it.
Okay, so that part, 23, the lame will take plunder, no resident will be sick. So those are good things. We have this reference to obviously ships with tackle and masts.
That aren't being used.
Yeah, so I think it's back to the enemy. It will be like their things, but I can't remember if that's right interpretation. So nobody checked that out for us, huh? Everybody was like me and they just thought, okay, that's nice.
But it's your, and he was just on.
Oh,
yeah.
I know. That
So-
was my issue there as well.
Yeah, so could it be that you don't have to go out in your ships to protect yourself? You don't have to go out in your ships to
Maybe.
provide for yourself. The prey of an abundant spoil will be divided among you. You'll have that provision, kind of a
Yeah.
thing. There won't be the sickness and a forgiveness. I don't know, because it
Yeah.
was you. It's tough to know if it's switching back to somebody else or keeping it.
Exactly.
The people.
Exactly. So anyway, we know the main focus here, right? The verse 23 at the end and verse 24, and that there is a picture of either or both. In a way, I think I let it just kind of live there because whoever it's describing, we know God has spoken that about both of them, about the enemies and his own people who will not be able to stand alone, or you could take that in either way. Anybody else have a thought on the end of chapter 33? Okay, so we go from a woe at the beginning and then a chapter that was describing things back and forth, then to a chapter that's very much focused on sort of two different people groups, but one very main description. When we look at verses 1 through 4, let's go ahead and read it because I think we have time. I think we'll make it. If B, are you okay to read pages or the first one, 1 through 7? And then who didn't read before? Melinda, can you read 8 to 15? Oh, that doesn't leave you much. Chrissy actually had raised her hand. Chrissy, will you just read 8 to the end? And then Melinda, I'll catch you for chapter 35. Okay, so B and then Chrissy.
Okay, draw near, O nations, to hear, and listen, O peoples. Let the earth and all it contains hear, and the world and all that springs from it. For the Lord's indignation is against all the nations, and his wrath against all their armies. He has utterly destroyed them. He has given them over to slaughter. So their slain will be thrown out, and their corpses will give off their stench, and the mountains will be drenched with their blood. And all the host of heaven will wear away, and the sky will be rolled up like a scroll, and their hosts will also wither away, as a leaf withers from the vine, or as one withers from the fig tree. For my sword is satiated in heaven. Behold, it shall descend for judgment upon Edom, and upon the people whom I have devoted to destruction. The sword of the Lord is filled with blood. It is sated with fat, with the blood of lambs and goats, with the fat of the kidneys of rams. For the Lord has a sacrifice in Bozrah, and a great slaughter in the land of Edom. Wild oxen will also fall with them, and young bulls with strong ones. Thus their land will be soaked with blood, and their dust become greasy with fat.
For the Lord has a day of vengeance, a year of recompense for the cause of Zion. Its streams will be turned into pitch, and its loose earth into brimstone, and its land will become burning pitch. It will not be quenched night or day. Its smoke will go up forever. From generation to generation, it will be desolate. None will pass through it forever and ever. But pelican and hedgehog will possess it, and owl and raven will dwell in it. And he will stretch over it the line of desolation and the plumb line of emptiness. Its nobles, there is no one there whom they may proclaim king, and all its princes will be nothing. Thorns will come up in its fortified towers, nettles and thistles in its fortified cities. It will also be a haunt of jackals and an abode of ostriches. The desert creatures will meet with the wolves. The hairy goat also will cry to its kind. Yes, the night monster will settle there and will find herself a resting place. The tree snake will make its nest and lay eggs there, and it will hatch and gather them under its protection. Yes, the hawks will be gathered there, every one with its kind. Seek from the book of the Lord and read. Not one of these will be missing. None will lack its mate. For his mouth has commanded, and his spirit has gathered them. He has cast the lot for them, and his hand has divided it to them by line. They will possess it forever. Their generation to generation will dwell in it.
Okay. That's a very descriptive chapter to read through. And but the good news, it's very clear. Right? It is very clear when you read this type of language. So when we look at verses 1 through 4, what group is the focus in 1 through 4?
Nations.
The nations, right? And so what is God saying about the nations in those verses? What's going to happen?
Indignation and wrath.
From whom?
God.
God.
From God, right? The Lord's indignation, his wrath. This is one of the places where we get those words that help us or cause us to have to look at ourselves and our times or our future, because how many nations are mentioned?
Oh,
All
The
the
world.
nations, right? His indignation against all nations, his wrath against all their armies. what is their end result there?
Utterly destroyed.
Utterly destroyed. Yep. Karen, were you going to say something else?
Yep, that was exactly what I was going to say.
Okay. So we see they're utterly destroyed. And then in case we need more descriptors about being utterly destroyed, we have verses 3 and 4. What is the picture?
Corpses are giving off a stench.
Yes. So you have probably like 3 different references to these dead bodies, right? Slaughter, slain, corpses, the description of how much blood, which is how is it described there?
Drenched.
Drenched, right? Mountains drenched with blood. Now, this was probably starting to ring a bell with some of you who did Revelation, not just Revelation itself, but also we did a bunch of cross references, some that we've looked at that started probably to sound familiar. Then you get to verse 4, and what do you learn? What else is going to be happening at this time? This one probably really rang a bell with some of you.
The sky will be rolled up like a scroll.
Yes, straight from where? Lines up exactly with, anybody know exactly where in Revelation? 6:14.
Yeah.
Yep, 6:14 says the same thing. The sky will be rolled up like a scroll, which is quite a picture when you try to think of that. So do we know probably then what time frame we're talking about here? And actually we've had other chapters that would tell us what time frame we're talking about in Isaiah 34, which would line up with our last one as well.
The last days.
The last days, right? When the Lord is going to come and battle all the nations, and we will see why here in a little bit. So the focus in verses 1 through 4 was all the nations, and then he changes focuses very specifically starting in verse 5. But most commentators will also say that even though we can take this very personally and specifically to this one nation, that this one nation also can still represent all nations. So, and we would see that. Who is the nation God focuses on starting in verse 5?
Edom.
Edom. So before we look and see what Isaiah 34 says, I want us to look at the background. I don't know if we'll get to all the other Old Testament references for the prophecy part, but I do want to make sure we all have the background because we learned something really important. So I think on page 154 and 5, you had your historical references to Edom starting in Genesis 25, and then we had a Numbers 20. Is anybody able to give us sort of this background on Edom that you learned from Genesis 25?
Descendants of Esau.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
The descendants of Esau.
Okay. What else do you know about him?
Well, he gave up his birthright, and Jacob ended up with the promise.
Okay. So who were they in relationship?
The Edomites?
Yeah, who were Jacob and Esau in terms of
Jacob
relationship?
and Esau. They were, who were they?
Just to each other. You go ahead. You're right.
Twins.
Twin brothers, right? So they were brothers. So we know Jacob represents Israel, and then we have Esau, and they did not have a good relationship, right? So why the focus on, our homework had you look at the focus of his name. What do you learn about Esau and Edom? What's the name have to do with anything? What's it mean? Is there a color associated with him? Red, right? Partly he had red hair, but then also when he sold his birthright for that bowl of stew, the actual thing in Hebrew that it is said, it's called a bowl of red. And so those focuses are so interesting in the Old Testament naming of things. Also, if you read about what's going to happen to Edom, does one particular color stand out in your mind? Red, because Blood is completely the focus. And they didn't tell you to mark blood. Those of you who've been doing precept for a while might have thought to mark blood, or you might have marked it just because it's in here so often, but it is a key word in scripture in general. So now that and numbers, we need to talk about then. So this was their history. It was always combative, I guess is the right word. When we get to Numbers 20, then what do you learn about what eventually happened between Esau? The Edomites became a nation of Edom. What do you learn in Numbers 20?
That Edom didn't give them passage, Israel, when they were on their way to the promised land.
Okay, so way back in Numbers, right? Way back at the beginning of the word, Edom did not give support or passage or help to the nation of Israel. And what does God say about that? Because of that, what's going to happen to the nation of Edom?
Be cut off forever.
This judgment, at least in part, is coming because the nation of Edom did not help or support Israel. So let's think about where we've been in Isaiah. We want to make sure we make this connection as we watch this pattern of God bringing judgment against nations. And as we have at the beginning of 34, so God has had judgment against his own people for not helping his own people, including the northern kingdom. Now we see, including Edom, we see this picture of all nations. What is one of the reasons then, can we say what one of the reasons is that God will someday judge all nations?
How they treat Israel.
How they treat Israel. Is there a scriptural basis for that besides this one story? What's the scriptural basis, Kim?
Oh, you would ask me that.
Oh, you don't need to give me a verse. Just I'll help you with that.
I mean, he's said particularly, this is those who bless Israel will be blessed, those who curse it will be cursed. And that's, is that in Genesis?
Genesis 12:3, I think. Yes. That promise comes before there even is a nation of Israel. That is when God calls Abram before Abram even obeys. This is in his promise to him when he tells him to leave his nation and go make another nation. He says, you will be blessed. You'll be a father of all nations. And those who bless you will be blessed. Those who curse you will be cursed. Is that promise still in place?
Oh, yes.
Yes. So when you have been asked throughout your homework, and when we look at the word all, that God is going to judge all nations, and we've had to look and see what we think about our nation, what do you think in terms of supporting or not supporting Israel? Is that something we have to pay attention to?
Oh, yes.
Yes. Historically, or at least since 1948, when Israel became a nation, how have we measured up in that regard? Overall, so far.
Overall, okay.
Or up to last year?
Up to last year, yes. Yes, up to last year, because this matters, right? I don't know if you guys know this. I just happened to hear somebody say it again. But in 1948, when Israel announced its independence, within 11 minutes, President Truman, because he believed this, recognized them as an independent nation. He was the first person, and he did it within 11 minutes of them announcing it. Since World War II, have we been a blessed nation? We have been blessed, right? We think we are the nation, right? And when we have been, but that's not our doing. It's the way we were founded and what we did with Israel. Now, as B said, up to last year, why would you say up to last year that we were still okay? And are we now still okay? What do you think? Do we know?
Well, the last administration had helped them again with some more, the Abraham Peace Accords. And they were doing the change of Jerusalem as the, where the embassy was located.
Okay, so what, go ahead.
So they were, he was
Yeah.
they were actively
Yeah.
helping and supporting them.
Yeah, I've heard some people say that since Truman, it's been probably the most supportive administration. Anybody know, how are we doing so far now? Or do we need to watch, or what do you think? No, Barb, not so hot.
I think we're in big trouble.
We're in big trouble. Why do you guys say that? Do you have any specifics for us in case people don't know?
Well, they have sided with a lot of their enemies,
Okay,
and they're talking to them and negotiating with them, and
Telling them their secrets. That was a good one. That was an interesting one I read this
that
week.
was interesting. That was very interesting. I held off on that one, but then it was reported by a major news source, the Wall Street Journal. And so I thought, oh, okay, well, there might be some legs to this. Yeah, we have to watch, and you have to watch beyond, you have to watch everything happening at one time, right? So on one hand, we need to watch who we're dealing with, right? Who we're giving money to, who we're supporting. If that nation is a nation that has said repeatedly they want to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, and we give them money and support, that might not be a good thing. Even though at the same time we're doing that, you might see a story that says we're fighting against that other nation. Well, it just so happens that right now both things are happening. Is that a good sign when one nation is dealing two different ways with one nation? That's actually not. So when you want to look, to me at least, at what's evil, it would be two-sidedness or hypocrisy, right? So even as, I don't know if you guys know this, I'm going to be quick. Just this past week, our own Navy ships had to send warning shots to boats from Iran who were approaching dangerously to our ships. It took warning shots from our ships to move them away. So that nation is also not dealing very wisely with us, and yet we are giving them money and want to continue to help them get nuclear weapons. Even as we also say we're still supporting Israel. If you ask our administration, would they say they're supporting Israel? Yeah, but are they in fact? So wherever you stand right now, obviously what we know is that in terms of our own future, we do have to watch to see what happens. But I see a bit of agreement that we could be in trouble, and this could be part of the reason why. This is going to be the reason. And if you're not sure if Jesus thinks the same way, you can go read Matthew 25 about how he's going to judge people at the end when he comes back. Sheep and goats are going to get judged on one thing. Anybody remember?
How they treat his brothers.
How they treat his brothers, how they treat Israel, and probably Christians at that point. But for
And
sure,
that's like the most misrepresented piece of scripture ever.
Yeah, maybe so.
Ever.
Maybe so. So again, we have Old Testament and New Testament alignment here. So that's usually a very strong indicator. Okay, so that I wanted to make sure we made this connection as we've talked about judgment of nations. Now we see this example of Edom, and we see the why. We've seen sin in general also as a reason, and we've looked at our own evil times and what God's thinking as he looks down. But now we see one also very specific reason. Okay, what do we learn about Edom and this judgment right here in chapter 34? What's the picture?
Streams turn to pitch, earth into brimstone, land burning pitch, not be quenched day or night. Smoke goes up forever. From
Okay.
generation to generation, desolation. None will pass through it forever and ever.
Okay, so we have that focus, and we kind of hit this a little bit, but right there in verses 5 to 7, that picture also looks like what? Before we get to the fire and brimstone,
Blood.
Blood that comes from where?
Sword of the Lord.
The sword of the Lord, satiated it's descending for judgment, right? When you find those words, good. In fact, the picture in 6 and 7, as you look at these animals, what do you get from that? What does that sound like?
Sounds like the sacrifice at the temple.
Sounds like the sacrifice, right? As if God is making a sacrifice here, comparing it to the animal sacrifice. So Barb kind of gave us the big overview of what we learn in the next verses 8 through 15. I do want to point out one verse where God also gives a reason, right? Here again, even without going to Numbers chapter 20, you've got a reason right here in verse 8. And what does he say there?
Vengeance, a year of recompense for the cause of Zion.
Okay, good. A day of vengeance for the cause of Zion, a day of recompense, a day of paying back, right? God will take that vengeance. So again, even without Numbers 20, you see the reason here. So Barb described this next point, and we get down close to this description of it being nothing, but something will be there. What is going to inhabit this area someday?
All these different animals. But I do think it's interesting that he says no one will pass through it forever when they didn't let Israel pass through.
Yeah, it's
Well,
yeah.
no one will pass through
That's
ever.
right. I love those connections. I do too. I think that is the perfection of God. Yeah, just those same, we've seen these similar descriptions before in other nations, right? This sort of desert wilderness that the only things that can live there will be the types of animals and wildlife that would live there. So that's what he said. There's this great ending part in here, and I don't know if you had to go look at commentary to figure it out. I did. It's beautiful, but the first line of verse 16 is awesome, and it's for us because we do this. But let's see if we can work out what he's telling us in verses 16 and 17. What does the first line say?
Seek from the book of the Lord and read.
Okay, so you all are doing that. So good for you. And here's Isaiah talking about that. Again, talking about the things that he's reading. Now, I think the easiest way to keep the rest of that verse is in context with what he says, because there's a semicolon there, right? So it has to relate. So seek from the book of the Lord and read the prophecies, read the things that have been said. And then what do you learn about that by reading what's a very poetic sort of description in verse 16? It might help you if you look at the second part, not one of these, instead of will be missing in our version, what if you said, not one of these shall fail, which is the way it's described in other translations. What isn't going to fail?
All these prophecies.
All these prophecies. So that's what we're talking about. Good. None of them will fail. You can go to John 5 and John 7 for Jesus talking about the same thing. None will lack its mate, right? So in a prophecy, do we have two parts? We have the prophecy and we have the fulfillment. So I saw it described in one way as that this is what that possibly indicates, that everyone will have a fulfillment. As we've pointed out here, all 300 prophecies about Jesus's first coming were fulfilled. That's a lot. His mouth has commanded and his spirit has gathered them. So the spirit, anybody know the spirit of the Lord is prophecy, right? There's a verse that talks about Jesus as being the spirit of prophecy. So that's interesting too. Okay, and how would you wrap that up then? After reading some commentary, I wrote kind of a summary statement about that. I don't know if this will help any, but what I took away was that by doing this, we get to compare what has been written with what God has done. And I think that that's what he's asking them and us to do. Imagine if the people Isaiah spoke to would have done that, or were doing that. Were they listening? Were they even paying attention to what he was saying or what had been said? They didn't listen. Okay, thoughts or questions on 34? Okay, who did I say I was gonna have read? Melinda, was that you? For the last one? Can you, it's just
Yeah.
10 verses. Do you want to just read the whole thing? And I would love for us to read it because that will do as much for our discussion as anything else. So 35, 1 through 10.
The wilderness and the desert will be glad, and Araba will rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It will blossom profusely and rejoice with rejoicing and shout of joy. The glory of Lebanon will be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the glory of the Lord, the majesty of our God. Encourage the exhausted and strengthen the feeble. Say to those with anxious heart, take courage, fear not. Behold, your God will come with vengeance. The recompense of God will come. He will save you. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped. Then the lame will leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute will shout for joy. For waters will break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the Araba. The scorched land will become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. In the haunts of jackals, its resting place. Grass becomes reeds and rushes. A highway will be there, a roadway, and it will be called the highway of holiness. The unclean will not travel on it, but it will be for him who walks that way. And fools will not wander on it. No lion will be there, nor will any vicious beast go up on it. These will not be found there, but the redeemed will walk there. And the ransomed of the Lord will return and come with joyful shouting to Zion. With everlasting joy upon their heads, they will find gladness and joy, and sorrow and singing will flee away.
And then don't you just sigh like when you finish that verse? Like, it makes me always go, oh, this is such a great chapter following the other one. So we just finished a chapter talking about in Edom, there will become a wilderness and desert. We've seen that is also going to happen to Judah in other chapters. This desert area will be desert. It will become that. In this chapter, we learn what is going to happen someday, though.
It'll all be restored.
It will be restored. It will rejoice. It will blossom. I know you guys weren't told to mark rejoice or joy, but you might have felt like it in this chapter. I mark it all the time in my scripture. So I have it marked here, and there's a lot of them. Even the lands that were described in chapter 34, right? When you look at these geographic places, Lebanon, Carmel, and Sharon, those places were just said they will become that wilderness only haunted by and inhabited by desert creatures. But what are they going to see someday?
Glory of the Lord.
The glory of the Lord. The majesty of our God. Verses 3 and 4, just a very specific part of the beauty of this chapter. And this, in case you had been wondering at the beginning where our question of the week came from, it came from these verses, right? That question and these verses really spoke to me at the time that I did my homework that week about, have you ever felt exhausted by the world? Do you know someone who's feeling exhausted? And we get some instruction from the Lord about that. What do we do? What do we need to do for each other and for others according to these verses?
Encourage the exhausted, strengthen the feeble, and tell them, take courage, fear not.
Yes, good. Now, there is an interesting connection. What is going to happen, and then what's the but?
He will
We just
save
saw
you.
He will save you, even though what? Is he not going to be doing anything?
The recompense of God will come.
Okay, so back to 34, the same thing. He will come with vengeance. He will come with recompense. But if you're part of that description we read, I guess in chapter 33, right? If you're those who are waiting, if you're those among the righteous, he will save you, right? When he comes with wrath against the nations, with that judgment, is that going to come against any individual who believes and accepts Jesus? No. In fact, when you look at the New Testament, when you look at Revelation and all the things Jesus says about this time frame, this is still coming for God to get people's attention. Just like we've talked about in past questions of the week, what will God have to do to get your attention? Well, God clearly knows what he has to do to get our attention sometimes. But this is a great promise for those of us who know him and believe him, and can be for anyone who still will, which in his long suffering, he's waiting to do. How else does he describe this time?
Glory and majesty.
Okay. What kind of things will happen?
The blind, the eyes blind will be open, the ears, deaf ears unstopped, the lame will leap, and the tongue mute will shout for joy.
Good. So we have a picture of healing in people. What's the next section tell us? What's going to happen to this wilderness?
Waters and streams.
Yep. That picture of healing, that picture of restoration, waters, streams, and at the beginning, it's going to blossom, right? There's a literal blossoming that will happen.
Healing in people, healing in land.
Yeah, good. And then because of that, what is going to be there? Again, in this place where he has created wilderness and desert for a while, what will it become, or what will go through it?
Verse 8, the highway of holiness.
Mhm. What does that say to you? What does that make you think about according to the description and just what you think?
It makes me think of their escape to Zion, where he says he'll protect them there. He's paved the way.
Yeah, that's a beautiful picture. And it's also just also in general at a time or a place where commentators have said that at that time, or in some of the other times as well, that there wasn't safe passage. Look at the times we just talked about Edom not providing passage for Israel. And then God says there's a time where you will know, no one will pass through there. But now he says there will be a day when some will pass on the highway of holiness. And what do we know about who will walk on it and who will not?
His own will walk on it, but nobody else.
Okay, good. What are some of the describers?
Clean.
Clean will walk on it, because the unclean will not.
Fools will not.
Yeah.
No lions or vicious beasts.
Okay, so what does that indicate to you about if you're traveling on this highway of holiness?
No danger.
It's safe.
It's safe. There's no danger. Good. And then he finishes with this, but again, who will walk there?
Redeemed.
The redeemed and the ransomed, those he has purchased back, those they will return. And where are they coming to? Zion, right? They're coming to Zion. Do you have any thoughts about how important Zion and Jerusalem are going to be when the Lord returns? You really can almost not mark a chapter of Isaiah without saying, oh, it's going to be in Jerusalem. So again, think now to the fact, the idea that even back in, I don't remember what chapter, I had a note about it that said God will protect Jerusalem. Remember that he's going to protect it. Is there a reason why he needs to protect Jerusalem besides the fact that he says it's his and belongs to him? If we look at just the context, why is God going to protect Jerusalem?
It's coming back there. He's got to keep it nice.
That's right. A lot of things are going to happen there. Now think about the enemy. Does the enemy of the world, does Satan, know what's going to happen in Jerusalem someday?
Yep.
Yeah, we're told he knows the word. We're told he knows. So do you think he's been at work and will be at work in trying to prevent anything from happening good in Jerusalem? Yes, just put that. That is why the word, to me, when you look at God's word in connection with what we see actually happening in the world, it really can just, I think for me, it's made me just so solid in my belief and my faith in what he says, because the truth of it is just in front of our eyes. It has been historically, and it still is. So I love the way it does that. I love being able to look at the promises. Okay. Thoughts, takeaways from that chapter, those chapters, some of those beautiful verses?
I was listening to a commentary. I think you might have listened to the same one on chapter 33, and it was that section, verses 22, where we were saying it sounds like our form of government. And Madison wrote that that's where he got when he was writing out, what our government should be. He took it from that section. So it's like these people that say that we weren't founded on a Christian, it's like, no, the founding fathers really did. They might not have all walked the same path, but they had a firm grasp of what the Bible said, and they based our government on the Bible.
Yeah, they truly did. And you can read any of their writings and you can see that is such a lie. It's become such a horrible, horrible lie. Again, I think we talked about years about the inscription on the inside of the Liberty Bell. If you were going to talk about freedom, most of us would probably go to John or some quote from Jesus. No, they went to Leviticus. So you are no slouch in the word if you choose a verse from Leviticus to inscribe on the inside of the Liberty Bell. Okay, so it's just a lie. You can read any of their writings for yourself and you can see what they thought. Why we would expect that they would have been perfect Christians, I don't know, because we sure aren't. So why we would expect that from them, but they will tell you in their own words how they formed our government. Again, part of the problem with that now is that we declared that to the Lord. And what is he watching for us to do? So it's a good news and bad news situation in my mind. But yeah, again, watch out for the lies of this world. It's just not true. It's never been true. It's not being taught anymore. But yeah, I saw another quote from Thomas Jefferson again, not a man who walked perfectly. However, he wrote that the things he said were he thought of them in terms of being a Christian, and then he specifically said a follower of Jesus Christ. So again, yeah, great connection there. Anybody feel connected to the verses 3 and 4 about, and our question of the week, have you ever felt exhausted by the world? Do you ever feel that weariness? Anybody relate to that question that week? Yeah. What do you do when you get exhausted and weary in this world?
Like the chapter, whichever that was, where the focus must be on the Lord and realize his bigger picture and the safety that he gives us as individuals, not always physical physical safety because he's got a plan. But to trust him so implicitly, so completely, that as I look around, I'm not shaken by it, but I can look and say, that's curious.
Yes, yes.
And
Psalm 62.
oh,
Psalm 62
yeah,
in my
thank
Psalms
you.
today says, I will not be shaken. Yeah, I will not be shaken. It's got so many of our words. Yeah.
Yeah, I think isn't
62.
Psalm 63, they counsel only to knock him down like a teetering wall and fence. That one, that's what the world is doing, trying to get us knocked down.
Yeah.
Our strength is in the Lord. We
Yeah.
focus on him. We see life from a bit different perspective, a lot different perspective, because we've got eternity even right now, and we have an unusual ability to think differently than the world. That's why they look like babbling fools sometimes. And it's like, how are you? Disconnect.
Disconnect. Yes. And that's part of the weariness, right? When you have to continually every day discern and decipher two different things being said as if they agree when they don't, and you have to try to live your life lining those up. There's only one plumb line, right? Scripture calls God the plumb line, God the measure. Psalm 119 talks about that. Lots of places say he really is the only measure that you can use to line it up. So yeah, I appreciated in those sections this week the description of the rock being impregnable, right? That word is not a word we use a lot, but in that one verse about being impregnable, like nothing is going to come against him that will stand. Things will come against, but look at the past 2,000 years of history and how often the church has been attacked. You know, God will have his people. He will have a remnant. He will have always a representation of who he is. So we have that promise. And he never disappears from our sight, as Barb keeps telling us, that if you focus in here, if you meditate on him and in heaven and in the far distant land, then you get to live there, because we're just ambassadors here, right? We're just sojourners. We're just travelers through. We're going to go home someday. So, yeah.
And you know how after you've been on a long vacation and it was good, but then you go home, you drive in the driveway and you go, oh, I think that's in a nutshell how the feeling is going to be when we arrive. It's like home. Right now, there's and some of it's, and in a way it's a vacation, in a way it's a work vacation, because it's so good. Life is so good, but it's like 50-50. So it's got this hard stuff to it. And you kind of persevere and you enjoy the easy, you persevere through the hard, and it's all good, growing, fulfilling, delightful, but it's nothing like going home.
No, nothing like going home. No, there's no place like home. I always love it when I can take movie lines and I always go, oh, that's God. You know, that sounds like God. They may not have thought so, but I do. I think so. So, okay.
Click our red heels together.
Yes, we click our little heels, our little feet and shoes together.
Because we're redeemed with the blood of Christ.
There you go. There's a good connection for you. Red shoes, we'll take it. We'll just turn it all back on what it should be, right? Yeah, thanks. Anybody else before we go to prayer this week? Remember, it's your last week of homework for Isaiah Part 1. So also try again to focus on what has been the most meaningful for you, whether it comes from one of the questions of the week, whether it comes from some new knowledge or focus or connection that you see as we've had to look every week at what's going on in our lives, and who knows what will happen between now and next Thursday. So that's the one thing we can count on, is that every week is different. Every week something new is going on. So we'll see what happens, but remember to make sure you take that sort of application time. All right, online watchers, I'm going to pause so our group goes to prayer. Pray in your time in the Word.